why should we study evolution? It has been said that evolution is very important for biology because it explains why we have become what we are, other organisms have become what they are. So in that sense, evolution provides explanation for example, why is it that some animals are colored, some of them are not? Why is it that some animals fly and others do not? These are questions that one can answer biologically as a mechanical engineer. How do birds fly? It's like designing an airplane. Or what benefits that birds gain by flying, and how did that make them lives different from organisms that do not fly? That brings in more ecology and evolution, which is my home section, and which is why we teach courses in ecology and evolution, I being the instructor of the evolution course. So today's discussion, why study evolution, I'm going to redirect it initially and say, well, then why study biology? Or more importantly, what is biology? If I was lecturing this class in auditorium, I would ask you all to raise your hand and indicate to me whether you're a biology major. And I think 99% of you would all raise your hands because you probably are biology majors. So then I would ask you, well, being a major that studied biology, if you went home for holidays a couple weeks ago and you did have a chance for a small family gathering despite COVID, you may have wanted to tell someone what is it that you study, which is what is biology. So in your mind, do you have a definition of biology? Well, bio means life, so biology means the study of life. But then that just kind of postpones the question because it will ask us, what is life? Whenever I ask people what is life, that's sometimes like a no-brainer, right? Everyone says, I know what life is. It's obvious. I'll see it when I know it when I see it. And that is true. If I give you a whole bunch of things, you can often pick up the thing that was produced by life or that represents life. And that is a problem that faced NASA, the space agency, which launched a mission to Mars in 1976, a long time ago. I was in graduate school then, which searched for life on Mars. If someone's going to do this, it means that they are going there with an intent, a mission, and they must have a definition of life, because if they're going to search for it, they're going to have to design experiments or instruments to find whatever they think life is. So mission to Mars, I'll go through that a little bit. They basically sent a rocket, 1976, up towards Mars. Took some time to get there. And when it got there, the rocket basically put into orbit around Mars an orbiter, and that's this one right here. I can use my laser pointer. So right here. And this orbiter circled Mars, and the bottom here was a capsule that got ejected. So over here, the orbiter, the capsule, the parachute letting the orbiter land, and then the Viking module, which was inside this capsule, landed, and here's an artist's representation of the Viking lander on Mars, ready to do its job, which is to look for life. Over here on the left side is a replica of that orbiter. There's one on Mars, and this replica, which was built on Earth with the one that went to Mars, is now at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. So if you go there, you'll see that it's a twin sibling of the one that's in Mars. This one over here is the real one. This orbiter had an antenna, so it could communicate back to Earth. And over here, you'll see a structure, which is what we're going to focus on today. This is an arm with a scoop or a scraper here at the end. This was the sampler on Mars that was supposed to reach out to Martian soil and scrape a sample of the soil for analysis as to whether there was life on Mars. This is actually a real image taken by the Viking lander. Over here is its arm, way over here on the left side. It's a panoramic shot, and here's the Martian terrain. This arm would go out, here it is, and take a scrape. This is artist rendition because there's no photographer there to take a picture. This is actually a real picture taken by the orbiter with the arm going out. And over here is a real picture of the scrape on the Martian soil that was sampled by the arm of the Viking lander. The question then is, what do we do with this soil? That goes back to our earlier discussion, what is life? NASA went through many, many discussions on what is life. So let's go through some of their ideas. I show you a bunch of rocks that I've collected over the past. And if I told you that these rocks come from nature, but one of them was made by a human being, I think none of you would have problems, right? Some of you may hesitate and say, okay, it could be this one or that one. But I believe most of you will focus on the arrowhead and say, that is the one that's created by a human being. Now, the one down here on the lower right happens to be a skipping rock that my son and I found, and we by camping, and we spent the evening throwing skipping rocks over the stream. And I ask you, okay, I know why you picked the arrowhead as one representing a human-made object. And I ask you why. You say, well, you know, it's kind of neat, it's very symmetrical. But then I show you this rock, and I say, isn't the rock symmetrical? And why can't that be a human-made? Now, the skipping rock could be made by a human. Someone could have improved on a natural one. But I think a lot of you also agree that if you've done rock skipping in a stream, this object over here, my skipping rock that I found with my son, could have been created by nature by random chances. That it's believable. But this being created by humans by random chance, by nature, by random chance, is less believable. So somehow the order and the structure of this arrowhead makes us think that it needed some living force to make it. These could be created randomly by physical forces, and even this round, beautiful skipping rock could also be. But the probability of getting this much order was just too high to have occurred without a living intervention, in this case, a human intervention. We therefore associate life with these creations of extraordinary, improbable events. That's a good way to define life, and NASA discussed that for a long time. But I just want to point out that there are sometimes problems, and that is this what I'm showing you. This is basically an ice crystal or snowflake. And crystals, when they're deposited or created by freezing temperatures, they will arrange themselves in an orderly way. And we know that physical laws, crystallization, can create ice crystals that are so beautiful and complex, and it doesn't require a living life to do it. But it's just to keep in mind that sometimes when we see something like this, we have to be careful and think carefully. And NASA then spent a lot of time thinking about this. A first experiment considered by NASA was the following. What is life? Life has proteins, at least on Earth. Proteins are just amino acids. So here I represent, this is the amount of biochemistry we're going to need for today. Amino acids are, beads that are strung together to make a long linear molecule. This is an amino acid, and that's a protein. These proteins then can go on to form two-dimensional, three-dimensional structures that can be very important for life functions, right? Proteins are enzymes. They do catalysis and do metabolism. But for now, all that we have to know is that proteins are a string of amino acids. I have a black ball representing one. This black ball then can be magnified to see its biochemical structure, and you'll see that there's always a carbon in the middle. On this side, there will be a carboxy, hydrogen. Here will be a more complex organic compound. Here we have methyl, CH3, And then on this end is a ammonium, which is NH2, nitrogen. All amino acids have this structure, but you know that there's 20 or more: valine, aniline, cysteine, tryptophan, et cetera, et cetera. And the way they vary is by having a different group where the methyl is in this case. This particular amino acid that I draw for you has methyl here, which means that it is alanine. Okay, right here, alanine. Going back to your biochemistry, you may remember that in this particular configuration with a carbon in the middle, these arms that I draw for these four components, carboxy, hydrogen, methyl, ammonium, etc., they actually come out into three-dimensional space. So I can draw these two as being on the plane of the, it used to be the board, this is now the computer monitor. So these two project from the carbon outwards to the left here on the same plane as your computer monitor. The ammonium group is projecting out from the screen towards you, and the methyl group is projecting into the computer screen away from you. This is a three-dimensional representation of what alanine could look like. But if you also remember that if you have this projection as a possibility, you can take this three-dimensional structure and rearrange it so it becomes the mirror image. And that's what I draw over here. So this is kind of through a looking glass through a mirror, and this is one image looking at the other. So in this case, the carboxy and hydrogen are still in the plane of the monitor, but the methyl now is going into the screen, but in a different left-right orientation from the methyl here. The methyls are both going inside, but realize that this is like a left hand, this is like a right hand. They are basically the same, but they're mirror images of each other. Chemically, as far as we know, they're identical, but they just cannot fit into each other like a hand into a glove. They can shake hands, but they cannot fit into each other as hands in glove. So appreciate this point. These are mirror images, which means that you cannot take this one and superimpose onto it. They will be pointing in different directions, such as your left and right hand, which you can put on top of each other, but they're not like gloves. The left and right hand gloves don't fit the opposite hand. It turns out that all amino acids in life on Earth, I shouldn't say all, 99.999% use amino acids of alanine that are of this configuration, and they are called L for levo or left, because when you shine a light through a pure concentration of amino acids of the L type, they shift light to the left, and these shift light to the right. That's an interesting phenomenon because biochemically, all these chemicals, D and L, are equivalent. So we could function with both. But somehow during the origin of life and its evolution, it decided to use only L types. That's very convenient because if I ever ask you what does life use, L or D amino acids, all you have to remember is that L stands for life and left, but on Earth, we are L. There's many discussions. If you take a class in biochemistry, they'll talk about perhaps why only one type evolved. It could be that on another planet, in another universe, if amino acids and protein chemistry evolved to control life, they'll all be D. We cannot think of reason why we could not have gone all D, but we went all L. Perhaps something about amino acids having to line up together, they do it better if they're all of the L type. Regardless, we are all L. So here's an idea. If we go to Mars, let's look for amino acids. If we find amino acids, should we find only L's? But that's like saying that D doesn't work. Well, okay, what happens if we go to Mars and we find all D's? Would that be interesting? I think that would be really interesting because if we found amino acids on Mars and they were all D, that suggests that they're very likely that there's a life form on Mars that has evolved to use only one of the amino acids. If we go to Mars and we find 50% L's and 50% D's, that'll be a very good indication that there's no life on Mars. Because if I take a bottle of L amino acids, pure, 100%, and let it sit in that, let that bottle sit somewhere for time, after a while, this bottle of 100% L, 100% will become 50-50. And that's because molecules here will by chance start rearranging themselves. And each time they rearrange, there's a good chance they'll become a D. So eventually I move from L's to D's. When D's become common, they'll become L, and the equilibrium is at 50-50. So a non-living pool of amino acids will become a 50-50 mixture. Did NASA do this experiment? For reasons that I don't understand, because I like this experiment, they did not do it. So what's the experiment that NASA did to look for life on Mars? This is what they did. Remember, they scooped up Martian dirt up here, red, okay? What they did was they took some of this dirt and dumped it into a test tube with nutrient broth. What is nutrient broth? If you've never taken a class in biology where they talked about nutrient broth, go to your own personal experiences and think of nutrient broth as being chicken soup, okay? If you took a class in microbiology, or you took a bio class where they gave you some microbiology, you probably were given some nutrient broth, which looks like chicken soup. And basically, it's liquid with nutrients in it so that you can grow bacteria. Bacteria, like life, likes to grow in water. We all need water, but also need food and resources. So the nutrient broth, chicken soup if you wish, has lots of nutrients, which is why they give it to you when you're sick. So if I were to take some dirt and throw it into a test with nutrient broth, and there were life, such as bacteria on Mars, I would get growth. This is what will happen if I did this experiment on Earth. If I do that, the bacteria will grow because there's soil, a bacteria in Earth soil. I actually work with bacteria and I grow them. And this is a picture I took out of my office of 2 glass containers over here with chicken broth, okay? I put some bacteria in here, and a day later, 24 hours, the chicken broth is grown up. And it becomes cloudy, okay? And that's because the bacteria are too small for us to see individually, but a whole bunch of bacteria, millions, if not billions of them, will make the liquid cloudy. Which is why if you don't have a good kitchen hygiene and you leave your chicken soup sitting on the countertop of your kitchen and you don't wash it and clean it up, you can come back a week later, it'll be smelly and the chicken broth will be turned cloudy. That's because bacteria in the air has fallen into it and grown up. So in essence, what NASA did was the kitchen version of the kitchen experiment that sometimes we have done by being messy in the kitchen. So what happens if you do this on Earth? On Earth, the bacteria in the soil grows, and I represent them with little black bars, and it produces gas. If you go back to this picture, you can see that it is a little bit more gaseous, bubbly on this side, okay? If you like beer, you know, beer is made not by bacteria, but yeast makes gases, which is why champagne and beer becomes fizzy, okay? So what NASA did was repeat this experiment and look for gas. So on Earth, we'll see gas and this will become cloudy. Actual results on Mars. So this experiment was done and they got gas. They detected gas on Mars. You say that should be a check because they have discovered life. But then unfortunately, NASA got cold feet. It turns out non-life chemicals also can cause a release of gas. So you can throw things in here that are non-living and they happen to be in the Martian dirt, gas will be produced. Peroxides are one, okay? In your life, you probably had a cut and someone threw hydrogen peroxide on you. it'll bubble, and you'll see all this bubbling at your wound. That's a release of oxygen. Peroxides often will release gases, so that could have caused the release of gas. Clays also act in the same way, and soils full of clay, so that also can cause the release of gas. So NASA got cold feet, and worrying about concluding that there was life on Mars, they pretty much felt that it was an ambiguous result and stopped discussing it, which is why most of you have probably never heard about the Viking mission to Mars to look for life, 1976. Because if they had found life on Mars, we all would have known about it much better. So the whole experiment, although very interesting, basically ended, and people don't talk much about it. And this is perhaps a lesson. You should never do in science an experiment when you do not trust a positive result, okay? I grew up watching NASA, and NASA is a bunch of rocket scientists, and I always thought that NASA was one of the smartest group of people in the world. But this is one experiment that I always wish that they had spent more time thinking about it. Never do an experiment in science when you don't trust a positive result. You may not find it conclusive, but at least have enough faith in it that you'll take the next step and use the information that you have learned. So today's class then is a discussion of this, and of course somehow at the end I got to weave evolution in, right? Because this is a class about evolution. And the way we're going to do it is to do this. Okay, let's be a little bit nice to NASA. I mean, it's hard. In order to go to Mars and find life, you have to have a definition. So they're still trying to figure out whether there's life on Mars, but the mission now is no longer to go to Mars and figure out on Mars. The goal is to take Martian soil, bring it back to the Earth, so that they can do all experiments if possible to find out whether there's life. That's a different approach, and then they can keep on improving and refining. But in 1976, they had only one shot. So the question then I would like to ask you is, let's think about whether they could have done a better job had they had a better definition of life. So, what is life? If this was a live lecture with you and all sitting in front of me, I would probably generate a longer discussion and have you participate. But being Zoom and then many students asynchronous, the discussion is much harder to do. So I kind of have skipped that step. And I just threw up all the things that students have given me over the past many years when I asked them in a live lecture, how would they characterize the traits that define life? And this is kind of a summary of what is thrown out. One common idea is that life is order. I touched upon that in discussing arrowheads and rocks early on in this lecture. Life seems to achieve order, so we think of order being a characteristic. Life responds to stimulus. If I touch you, you'll move away. When a zebra sees a lion, it reacts. The lion also reacts. So that visual stimulus makes them either run for their life or try to find something to eat. Life is homeostasis. We all have a body temperature that's around 37 degrees Celsius, 98 Fahrenheit. If our body temperature deviates from that, we think that we're sick. So our body tries to maintain a constant homeostatic temperature. Why? Well, because we have all these chemical reactions going on in our body, and they have evolved to work best at a certain temperature. So we have that temperature, and we want to maintain it. But to do that, our body needs to have homeostasis, which is to say, we go too warm, we have a mechanism to cool. We go too cold, we have a mechanism to warm up, and that achieves homeostasis. Birds, for example, have a higher body temperature. We're 37 Celsius. Birds are 40, 41 Celsius. Why? Perhaps because flight requires a higher metabolism, so they keep their body at a higher temperature rate. Their homeostasis point is different from us. Next item, reproduction. A characteristic of life is that we're able to reproduce. That's a very important one. And often that's the first one that is listed. Reproduction is how we perpetuate our species. It is how we have, as they say, populated this planet. And during that process of reproduction, we have reproduced not only ourselves, but our whole population into other species. And then all these species have become more. And that's why we see the diversity of life on the planet. However, everything that we do, getting order, responding to stimulus, homeostasis, reproduction, has a cost. The cost is that it requires energy. So living things consume energy. And that's also another topic that's said to characterize living things. And then finally, there's a topic of genetics. Life reproduces, and during the reproductive process, we copy information that's encoded in our genetics, our DNA, and that's passed on to our offspring. So if we have a certain coat color, our fur is brown, our offspring will have brown fur color. If our offspring, if we have black fur color, our offspring will have black fur color. So genetics is another characteristic where like begets like. In other words, we have parents and offspring that show a similarity. All these are good definitions, but then the question then is, are they exclusive to life? If we go to Mars, we want to have a definition that's exclusive because we don't want to be misled, right? We want something that we go to Mars and we see it, we say this is life, instead of getting cold feet and backing off again. So let's go for these and reject if they're not exclusive, okay? Order. Well, I showed you ice crystals, and ice crystals are extremely orderly, and that is very well known among the physical chemists and biochemists, that crystals often form in a very orderly way. If you, as a child, played with sugar crystals, you can make a very concentrated solution of sugar by heating it up. And then if you chill the sugar concentration, you'll make sugar crystals, right? And that was fun, it was delicious. But if you remember back, those sugar crystals have very sharp faces because there's an order in how those crystals condensed onto the shape. So although order is good as a first start for what is life, it may not be general enough to allow us to go to Mars and say we have life with degrees of certainty and confidence. Response to stimulus. We clearly do, but we can design machines that do. Homeostasis is another form of responding to stimulus, right? If the body temperature goes up, I respond to that stimulus, warmth, by cooling myself. And it turns out we have thermostats, right? Thermostats respond to variation in temperature of your house. And if it gets cold, the thermostat turns on the heat, and therefore your house achieves homeostasis. The simple device behind your bathroom toilet that keeps the water level constant is a form of homeostasis. It keeps the amount of water in that container constant. It responds when the water goes up, it responds when the water goes down. So the idea of response and homeostasis is also possible in systems that are physical and not life. Now, you could say that these machines and thermostats are made by humans. Well, then we can go into the biochemical world. And then if you think of a buffer, what is a buffer? A buffer is a chemical solution that keeps the pH at a constant range. That is all physical. You just have to put the chemicals together. So in that sense, a buffer also provides homeostasis. So homeostasis, although again, better, it has problems because physical systems also can do it. Going down the list, we have a bunch that makes things a little bit harder. Reproduction, the consumption of energy, and genetics. Let's deal with reproduction and energy first. As I have written out here, they're harder to reject, okay? Because if I ask you now, Can you think of anything that is non-life from your own personal experience? Can you think of something that's non-life that reproduces and uses energy? It's hard. If you've been for this discussion, you may have some ideas, okay? Whereas order, respond to stimulus, homeostasis, if I asked you from your own personal experience, you probably could have come up with ones, but reproduction and energy is much harder. So does that mean that reproduction and energy cannot be rejected as being characteristics of life? And we could then look for reproduction and use of energy on Mars as a way to identify life. Well, it turns out there are chemical reactions that are purely physical, non-life, which will reproduce and consume energy. I'm not going to go into those because it's very complex chemistry, but I'm going to give you one that's closer to your life experiences, in fact, quite close to your life experiences, where the reproduction and energy process are part of it. And that is fire, okay? If you think of fire and look at it, and I ask you, do fires consume energy? They clearly do, right? They're burning everything and releasing incredible amount of heat, energy, which is why fires are so destructive. They burn down everything. Can they reproduce? Well, if you follow the fires in California recently, they clearly have been reproducing. So here's an example of a fire from several years ago. And what happens is as the fire burns, embers, small pieces of wood, small pieces of leaves that are burning are blown away by the wind. And a little ember can then be blown downwind miles, land somewhere else, start a new fire, and basically reproduce the process. So from a very crude way, fires have these characteristics. They can reproduce, they can spread, and they need energy to do that. As I said, there are chemical reactions that do that. So is reproduction and energy consumption true hallmarks of life, or really not? Fire would say that it is not, and that we have to be very, very very careful. And we went to Mars and found processes, chemical processes that use energy and reproduce. Again, we should have to be careful and not overblown that as being evidence for life. That then leaves us with a problem. What is life? So let me focus on fire to use it as a way to generate the next discussion. Here we have a human event, the Olympics. This happens to be a very, very old Olympics from a long time ago. But every year or every other year that they have an Olympics, the winter or the summer games, a big cauldron is lit up with a fire called the Olympic flame. This Olympic flame is a very interesting phenomena. To give credit to the origin of the Olympic Games in Greece, the flame is first lit in Greece using solar mirrors to concentrate the heat of the sun and to light up the torch, the Olympic torch. So here's a collection of Greek high priestess lighting the torch using a concave mirror. This torch then is supposed to contain the flames that will be passed from human to human, athlete to athlete, from Athens all to the new place where the Olympic venue will be taking place. So the torch is then used to light the Olympic torch that's given to an athlete. That's the blue one right here. And here's the athlete. And the athlete then will start running, carrying the torch towards the new venue, which I think the one I'm going to show you was in Australia. So they will carry the torch, and when they get tired of running, they light another torch for another runner. That runner takes it on. We then got across the oceans because Australia is very far away. So one athlete jumps into a plane with the torches in the little brass containers. That then is flown across the ocean, And then finally they make it to the venue, and the Olympic torch is lit up using the flame that was started in Athens, Greece, many weeks before. Somehow in this notion is the idea that they've connected Greece with the Olympic venue by having this torch, almost a living thing, being carried all the way there. And if for some reason some poor athlete drops the torch into a pond and it goes out, that would be a horrible thing, because you don't want to relight it. But it's important that there's a continuity, as if flames, as if the fire was a form of life. So what I want you to then reflect is the following. If we have an athlete, a high priestess that lit the flame, then gave it to an athlete, and then it made it to the end and the cauldron was lit. Is the fire, are the flames that started here in Greece and ended up here in the Olympic cauldron, are they really the same? Are they the same color? Are they the same temperature? If you reflect upon that, what you'll come to realize is that flames, fire, if they have a color or a temperature, that depends on the fuel that they were burning. So to answer the question whether fires, this one and this one, are the same, I need to know the fuel that's been used here and here. This fire probably used some liquid to burn. This one's using some gas, natural gas, propane. So the temperature here and there are probably very different, and the color, although they may look the same, may not be identical if we did it in a more exact analysis. And the reason for that is that fires have a phenotype. What is a phenotype? A phenotype is how you look to the world. Fires have phenotype. This one is bigger, perhaps brighter, perhaps more white than yellow, and this one is more yellow, etc., etc. But their properties are determined, their phenotype is determined totally by their environment. And that's because fires have no genetics, fires have no genotype. You have genetics, you have a phenotype. Your phenotype is determined by your environment, the food you eat, how you're educated, but also by your genotype. So your phenotype is determined by genotype and environment, but fire only has an environmental component. And that is a big distinction why fires cannot be living. They have no genetics. Therefore, as a result, they'll also always be like their environment, whereas you have a genetic component. An interesting comparison that I noticed this morning as I was getting ready for this lecture is that the high priestess here is also holding, I believe these are laurel leaves, okay? Turns out the runners do carry laurel right here from Greece all the way to the new site. So we could ask, if these laurels were now grown in a soil at the new Olympic place, would it have the same characteristics as the laurel in Greece? The answer is not necessarily, because the soil in this new venue, Australia, could be different from the soil in Greece. But there's certainly going to be a higher similarity between the laurel in Greece when it's transplanted to Australia than when the flames in Greece are transplanted to Australia. So all this was just a way to highlight what I think is the importance of genetics. And genetics becomes important because genetics leads to evolution. And the definition that I would like to throw out for you is that life is the ability to evolve by evolution through natural selection. How does genetics and evolution tie together? That is in many ways the goal of this class. And today's lecture is simply to argue that perhaps if this was something that NASA knew to use, they would have been able to find out an answer as to whether there's life on Mars in 1976. So let's walk through this and try to tie together genetics and the ability to evolve by natural selection. What is evolution by natural selection? I'm going to summarize this course in one slide. And you may say after this, well, gee, do we need a whole course? Because evolution by natural selection is incredibly simple. It is incredibly simple. And I can summarize it in one slide for you. But what the beauty in my mind is, this process that I'll show you, simple as it is, can create so much complexity that I hope to justify that we can spend a whole quarter studying it. And just to give you an idea, this process is what's created you, all the other species on this planet. And that's certainly a very, very successful and complex goal. And the fact that a simple mechanism that I can explain on one slide created it really is a testament to the power of evolution by natural selection. So what is evolution by natural selection? Well, I mentioned earlier, evolution occurs in a population. So here I draw for you a population of giraffes, okay? We know that giraffes are tall with long necks. Why? So they can reach up into the trees and eat leaves. Why eat leaves? Well, because there's lots of animals eating grass. Giraffes are herbivores. They eat plant material. They eat grass. But so do zebras, antelopes, cows, all sorts of other things. So there's a lot of competition for eating grass. Meanwhile, trees have evolved to be tall so they can escape being eaten by zebras. Well, now there's a food source up in the sky. So one animal, one species, one population began evolving to become taller so they could eat the leaves. How did that happen? Genetics. If I have a whole bunch of short giraffes, by chance a mutation can make a giraffe taller. So this is the state that I enter the picture here in this diagram for you. I have a whole bunch of short giraffes, there's a mutation, and I got a taller one. What happens next? This individual that's taller can eat the leaves on the tree, it gets fatter, it is stronger, therefore it has more babies. So we have to follow this into the next generation. This one has more offspring. What's the consequence of that? Next generation, this individual, by having more offspring, will have a higher contribution, and I'll have taller individuals, more of them in the next generation. This process by which a population where I have some individuals that are doing better than others, more offspring, leads to the production and higher representation of those types, those phenotypes, the next generation, simply by this is called natural selection. There's a selection process, but there's no one selecting. It's a natural process, and that's what Darwin, who started with this, coined. It's a natural process through the differential reproduction. Because I have this, if I were to quantify this population and this one, I can document the change. I can count the number of tall giraffes. I went from 1 out of 6 to 4 out of 6. So there's been an increase. I can measure the average height here. Okay, so just say these are 1 yard, 3 feet. This is 6. So the average is, slightly above 3 feet. But over here now, I got 4 individuals that are close to 6 feet. So the average is now increased closer to 6 feet. So all these are ways to monitor and document the process of evolution. And the change, the population change from here to here is evolution. So this diagram summarizes everything. I have a population. If someone reproduces more, there's more representation. That's natural selection. Has the population changed? It has. It's gotten taller. That change, the population, is evolution. I said earlier that individuals cannot evolve. This individual is tall and will remain tall for its entire life. This individual is short and will remain short for its entire life. but the population changed, and that's evolution by natural selection. This is a very, very abbreviated picture. There's lots of problems with it. Part of the goal of the course is to understand the problems. But if you just understand the basics, I hope you see how evolution by natural selection proceeds. This is the entire picture. So keep that in mind, and we're going to use it for today, okay? The end result is that we have a giraffe that can reach to the trees. That does not mean, okay, people all say, well, does that mean it's bad for all the short organisms? No, all these individuals, they continue eating the grass, and they are still around. The short giraffes are not, because the short giraffes evolved to be tall ones, but we still have zebras, we still have gazelles and antelopes, and they are doing fine, making a living, eating the grass that's down here. Giraffes have gained a new food source, but it doesn't come for free. Giraffes have to reach up there, which means it's very hard for them to drink water that will always be down here. Water does not occur up in the sky. So giraffes, although they gain food, they become vulnerable when they have to reach down to drink water, and that's so often where they are killed by predators. So it's a balance, but they have evolved to reach up. If genetics allows us evolution, it comes in the following way. If this giraffe happened to be tall because it was born on a year where lots of rain and there was lots of food, but that was an unusual, exceptional year, then this height of the giraffe, its phenotype, tall, height, is not genetic, but environmental. And I repeat, if this giraffe happens to be tall because it was born next to a lake or at a rainy year and therefore has lots of food, its phenotype, height, tall, is environmentally determined like the fire and not genetic. As a result, when this tall giraffe reproduced, you can ask, will the offspring of this tall giraffe be equally tall the next generation? Think about it. The answer to that question should be depends on where they were born. If the next generation happens to be a rainy year, these will be tall, yes. If this giraffe has babies next to the lake, they will be tall, yes. But if the lake dried out and the rains didn't come, then all of these will not be tall, but they'll be short. Therefore, a hidden assumption of evolution by natural selection is that the phenotype that I see here that's different from the rest, the phenotype that's giving me more offspring, requires genetics. It requires that the phenotype be able to pass that information to the next generation to create this increase. So that's a complexity that I add to you, just so that we can end by tying together evolution by natural selection and genetics. If you noted, the next lecture is on mutations, so genetics will be brought in and made the highlight of the lecture. But for now, this is the extent that I need you to assimilate. Life is the ability to evolve by natural selection. That requires genetics, and that is the definition of life that I want you to entertain, partly for selfish reasons, because I want you to understand the importance of evolution. Because I think evolution gives us such a better understanding of life that we actually can use it as a definition. Then, of course, the proof of the pudding is that I will try to convince you that with this view that life is evolution by natural selection, we can actually redesign the Viking experiments to make it a little bit better. So I see that I have 30 minutes left. So what I'm going to do in the next 30 minutes is walk you through the Viking experiments where we will incorporate our new definitions and understanding of what is life. Just as a reminder to everyone, I sent out an email giving you links to the slides that I present in this PowerPoint. What I've done is taken the key slides and made them into PDFs. Hopefully some of you are using that. If not, after lecture, go to the Canvas site and look for them, and you'll see these diagrams. If you're taking notes, which I do encourage, sketch these diagrams that I'll draw loosely, and then you'll have the better copies in the PDF. Okay, let's go back to the experiment. We do this. They throw soil here in the experiment on Mars. Gas comes up. We don't know what caused the gas. We're a little bit worried. How can we improve on this given what we know now from this discussion and what is life? Well, here's an idea. Let's take the liquid in here and take a drop and drop it into another tube with new, fresh broth, okay? Something has happened here where gas has been produced. So let me take a small drop and transfer it to a new tube. Not the old tube, but a new tube. You can pipette, right? Or if you've taken lab classes and you use pipetters, take that and transfer it. What does this do? Well, what is the expectation if it's bacteria? If it's on Earth and this gas is produced by bacteria that were in here, that came from the soil, that were dropped in here and then grew up, if I transfer a drop, there'll be bacteria in here. So when this drop falls in there, bacteria will now be eating this nutrient. In that case, it will grow up with time and gas will come out again. Why? Because bacteria can reproduce. Bacteria satisfy the definition that life is reproduction. So I can do it once, I can do it twice, and I'll see gas twice. Let's do it again. Another drop, I'll see gas 3 times. This will allow me to do a graph that will look like this. Here are transfers, which is really time, and here's the amount of gas. It's the same. Bacteria do this on Earth because every time I dilute them by pipetting, this is the dilution, right? I got lots of bacteria here. I take a small amount, I reduce it, I dilute, but they grow back and the gas comes out. So despite the fact that the bacteria is diluted every time, they grow back up and create gas for me, and they satisfy the definition of life as reproduction. Is that conclusive? Not yet, but it was better than what NASA did in 1976. Why is that? Because if the expectation of the gas production is clay or chemical, what would happen if I did this dilution? Would I see the same result? What happens if there's clay in the soil of Mars? Let's walk through that. So here's the clay. I color the clay red. Over time, the amount of clay doesn't change or increase because clay doesn't reproduce, but clay does produce gas. So here's the gas coming out. I now take a small drop of the liquid, which contains clay, and transfer over here and drop it into a new tube, as we did in the previous study with bacteria. But now we're doing with clay, and hopefully we could have done this on Mars. What would happen to this clay? It'll drop in here, dissolve, become diluted. Would it make gas? Well, if the hypothesis is that clay makes gas, yes, gas will be made, but will be different. Clay is diluted because it cannot reproduce. I make it pink for you to represent the dilution, but because there is less clay here than here, less gas will be generated. This is an important distinction between life that reproduces and clay that does not. If I were to do this experiment, I'd be diluting the clay. Do it again, and I get even less and even less gas, which is to say that if you did this experiment on Mars and it was clay, the graph would look like this line, where the amount of gas declines with every dilution. It's a physical process. I get less and less clay, less and less gas. So this is a simple experiment that NASA could have done in 1976. It's an experiment that you could have done in the laboratory. And my my regret is that NASA did not sit down and think carefully, because they could have done this long time ago. And would it shown that there is life? I do not know. But it would have shown that perhaps it was not clay. And that really would force us now to think carefully what is on Mars. How about our last discussion on genetics and evolution by natural selection? Can we incorporate that into our definition of life and apply it to this experiment, the Viking Mars experiment in looking for life? Think of the image that I showed you about giraffes. Get this picture of evolution in your head. A population, one does better because it's a mutant. Because of that, it has more offspring, natural selection, as a result of population change. See whether you can put this in your head, conceptualize it, understand it, feel it, and can you recast it into this experiment so that we know whether we have life or not on Mars? Would this curve change if there's evolution by natural selection? This is simply reproduction of bacteria and failure of clay to reproduce. What happens if the bacteria on Mars could evolve? Would this curve be different? Let's walk through that. So this is a recapitulation of the experiment of bacteria on Earth, or if there were bacteria on Mars. Here's the soil, bacteria is put in here, they grow up, produce gas. I take a droplet, throw in here, they reproduce and make more gas. Here's the question. Could bacteria evolve to be better at consuming broth? When you take some soil on Earth and throw it into broth, if you took this soil from some garden, chances are that that bacteria has never seen chicken broth. So when you throw it in here, the fact that it grows in chicken broth is just that, they like food, okay? But it is probably not the perfect food for bacteria. They can grow and produce gas. But some of these bacteria, if they acquire a mutation, they could become better at consuming that broth. If that's the case, when I transfer those bacteria over and put them in here, and they grow up again, those mutants that use chicken broth better will probably be more represented. And because they use the broth better, what does better mean? It means that instead of making only one baby bacterium by eating a chicken broth molecule, they can make 5. That means being better, being more efficient, because this is a food now that they've mutated to use better. If that's the case, one could expect perhaps that more gas will be produced. This will not happen quickly because that mutant over here will be rare, like the tall giraffe is 1 out of the population. But as taller giraffes or better bacteria increase in numbers in a population, perhaps more gas will be produced. So if I transfer this over and here's now this mutant, next year I'll change the PowerPoint to make that mutant red over here, okay? So you can imagine 1 red here, 2, 3, 4 red here, 2 red here, so this is almost all red. All of a sudden I get more gas. Which is to say that if we did this experiment on Mars, and not only do we have bacteria or something, maybe not bacteria that reproduces, but something that also has a genetic system on Mars, and therefore can mutate and evolve, what we will see is that this curve will not be flat, but will increase with time. I would guess, and this is what I would say to end this lecture, is that the NASA experiment was done in 1976, and they got a flat line. I would say, that's pretty cool. There's something that reproduces there, but could it be life? there's still a window that says no. If it went down, we could categorically say that it was a chemical and not life. But if the curve went up, I can think of no other reason for why it would do that, except that it evolved by some process similar to evolution, which is, in my mind, the defining property of living things. Only living things can evolve. Nothing else. We know of no other example where something evolves as life does on this planet. We can think of things that reproduce. As a result, this is my preferred definition of what life is. Life is evolution by natural selection. So far, all Earth non-life forms are not able to evolve by natural selection. All Earth life forms are able to evolve by natural selection. So I'll end with a caveat, a warning. Of course, who am I to say that just because I do not see non-life things evolving by natural selection on Earth, there cannot be non-life forms that evolve by natural selection on another planet like Mars or further away. But in some ways, you know, my way out of that is I would say, well, those non-life forms that are evolving by natural selection are fooling you. They are life, okay? And I know that that becomes a semantics, but realize why we need semantics. Semantics are giving us definitions, and ultimately we have to communicate. So we have to give words definitions. So I'm defining life as evolution by natural selection, partly to sell you this class. And you don't have to buy it, but I hope you appreciate the uniqueness and importance of evolution by natural selection, at least on this planet, okay? If non-life forms on Mars evolve by natural selection and we don't want to call it life, that's another issue. If they're evolving by natural selection, they're coming almost 100% to be like what we are, okay? But that's not an issue for our discussion. Our discussion is, I want you to appreciate the importance of evolution in helping us think about life, which is the topic of biology. And I hope I've illustrated to you by redesigning an experiment that's done in 1976 to illustrate that we incorporate evolutionary thinking. There are some tweaks, changes that we could have done very simply and made that experiment much more informative.